I did mean to announce at the beginning that at the end of our service today, we're going to have a discipleship initiation after the festival. So time your sense of participation to include that if you like. It'll add a few minutes to the end of what we're doing. As most of you know, I've been part of Ananda, living in one of the communities, working closely with Swami Kriyananda during his entire lifetime, which I shared about 45 years of that. Those were very educational and entertaining years. That's a reference to Master saying that life should be educational and entertaining. And that's sort of how we often tease one another when we're faced with something difficult. Oh, it was educational and entertaining. That's what we're here for. Sometimes more educational, sometimes more entertaining, but we can always try to put them together. Those people who have never actually tried to manifest something from nothing may not appreciate the relentless drive that is required to bring energy to a focus and then to give that energy new form. In 1968, I believe it was, Swami Kriyananda was invited to look at some property up near Nevada City, California, where we now have a very large community. There were several well-known figures at the time. Let me think, Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder, who were both, I think, beat poets is what you called them at that time. This is all ancient history for many of you. And they were buying land, and Swami Kriyananda was on his own, having been separated from Master's organization, and he wanted to found a community. So he went up to this property on which there was absolutely nothing. And 72 acres of it spoke to him, as he put it. He said he felt the Masters had already blessed it, and were just waiting for him to find it. So he purchased that property, and a few years later, he purchased 6 miles down the road what is now Ananda Village. I arrived in 1971. At the time, I was slightly a latecomer, although that distinction got a little, faded out as time passed. I ended up being member number 15, final member when it was, for all the comings and goings. A lot more than 15 came and went, but of those of us who stuck with it, I was number 15. My official number is 13, but they made a mistake. So in any case, I watched it go from nothing to something, just from, dirt on the ground to primitive huts, to teepees, to sheds. In 2012, when I was part of the crew that was making the movie that became Finding Happiness, which is a film, it's really a documentary, but we filmed it. We had an actress playing a journalist, and then we had all of us playing ourselves, and she came around to find out about Ananda. The plot's pretty thin, let's just put it that way. But it worked, it made the event. And we came to the point where she was coming up to come and stay at our Expanding Light. And this was a whole Hollywood crew. We had a Hollywood director, and actually literally from Hollywood, but that type, that was what we were trying to work with, and it was a very professional crew. They were a great group, and we all just melded wonderfully. The director's name, Ted Nicolau, he was marvelous all the way from the beginning to the end. So I was sort of hosting and helping, and I had some official title, I don't know what, but I bring them in, and we've chosen our best guest room, and we are so proud of it. And all of them go, really? Is this where we're going to bring her? Like this is the big, here we are at Ananda. And I said, oh yes, look, it has indoor plumbing. And it was just like, how much higher can you get up the food chain than indoor plumbing? And it's a private bathroom even. Like, wow. And they were just appalled, is actually the only word I can use. And then I sort of, I tried to get into their heads about it. And I looked at it, and, the concept of Motel 6 used to actually mean something. It was like just the bare minimum where you did have indoor plumbing and a private bathroom, but there wasn't one thing extra in there. And I sort of looked at the room, and I realized these are Hollywood people. They do not travel like this. They stay in classy places and so on. And I saw it through their eyes. So I went to Ted. I said, Ted, you have to understand, that was a dirt spot. I knew that room when it was a dirt spot. You have no idea what it takes to take something from nothing, to bring it to anything at all. And so, that was just because he was a friend, and I wanted him to understand that we weren't blind. It's just that we were looking at it from another angle. So there was no choice. She had to stay there. And in the movie, if you watch it, I love this. There's this little scene. She comes into this room, and she sort of looks at it and says, well, it won't hurt me to live like a monk for a week. And that's how they kind of got around it. Now, I'm saying all of this. This is just one very small example of what for me, for many years, was a daily experience, because I worked for Swamiji, and there was a period of time where every single day, almost every day, I would go over to his house at 4 in the afternoon. I'd arrive at 4. There was no telephones, no internet hadn't even been conceived of. There was no telephone at where he lived. There was no mail delivery. So I was a secretary, and I would come over with several others and deliver the mail, tell him what the world was doing outside. He was writing his autobiography. He was in seclusion. Sometimes I'd be gone by 4:30. Sometimes I wouldn't be gone till after midnight. He'd have projects, we'd do work. He had no sense of the clock. I understand that Master was very much like that. People said that Master would just call you whenever he wanted to call you. It would be 2 in the morning. He would just call just to talk or whatever he had to say. Swami was close to that, but not quite. He just moved with the energy whenever the energy would move him. And I watched him every single day just face into the resistance of the material plane itself, and then a step beyond that, the resistance of what we're calling now is the shadow. That's the words that are in our reading today. Those are words Master uses. In his poem, Samadhi, vanish the veils of light and shade, Master calls it. Shade, shadow, it's the same word. You think, most obviously, you would say light and dark. That's how we tend to make the distinction, isn't it? But it's very interesting that in many of the scriptures, in many of the mystical literature, they don't talk about it as the dark. They talk about it as the shadow or as the shade. And of course, you see, it's a magnificent shift. Language is not accidental, especially when we're talking about revelation. Because shade itself owes its existence to light. Isn't that an interesting way to think about it? Because we're always trying to understand, what darkness is, why is there evil, why do people suffer? Everything owes its existence to light. But we can step out of that light, we can turn our back on the light, we can be in such a way that the brightness no longer touches us, but the light never changes. The only thing that changes is our experience and our perception of it. And we're living in times when there's a lot of shadows, and there's a lot of shadows that are just like incomprehensible shadows. How do we ever get into this? How can people who have beating hearts and children that they love, how can people be doing what they're doing? But well, there you are. They're doing it. This is the world that we live in. There is this world between light and shade. And Swamiji's life was, how do I say it? Was one battle after another right from the very beginning, just a constant issue between light and shade. So you would think it's so common that what happens to the ordinary mortal is when they struggle and their efforts are unappreciated and appreciated, when people that they trust and love turn into, as Swami always called them, self-styled enemies. He would never, ever call anyone an actual enemy, but he acknowledged the reality that they had styled themselves as his enemy. And even when we were being, I say we because it became all of us, were being attacked through the courts and vilified in the press, which went on for more than a decade. You know, all of this stuff fades into history, and we just sail in and just don't think about it anymore, just like that Hollywood crew came and thought, this isn't much of a hotel room, but it used to be a dirt spot. You have no idea how many people day after day after day just were able to do this. And the reason we were able to do it is because Swamiji led the charge and set the bar really high. I cannot say for an absolute fact because I wasn't with him every day of his life. But to my experience, I never saw a day pass when he didn't do some creative work and in some significant way uplift the lives of people around him. Even on the very day that he died, he came out of his bedroom at his home in Assisi, where he was at the time, and he walked over to his computer to check his emails because he had people all over the globe in every time zone who were always reaching out to him. He carried on a massive personal correspondence. It was astonishing to me. Well, not astonishing, but it was extraordinary to me when I have heard over the years how many people had long, continuous personal email exchanges with Swamiji. So what he would always do as soon as he came out from his room, he would go right to his computer to see who might need him. And that was the reason entirely. Who might need him? Who might be in crisis? Whose life will be altered with just a few words? And then he got it from his computer, sat at the breakfast table, and had a seizure. And 15 minutes later, he breathed his last. But just to the very last moment, that's what he was doing. And now, there were many times during all of those years when things were far from cheerful. I rarely, and I can only think of 2 instances when I heard him actually express emotional exasperation. One of them, I think, was for my benefit. During the time when I was, it don't mean he never spoke strongly. He would speak strongly if it was necessary, but the kind of frustration that I witnessed. Actually, there were a few more instances, but this is the one I witnessed. We were having a lot of trouble at that time making our guest programs work. We just couldn't find, this was at Ananda Village, what is now the expanding on. We couldn't quite find the right manager, and I mean, it was limping along, but it wasn't flowing. And another man who had responsibilities completely in another area wrote Swami what, to my mind, because I was his secretary, I read the letter first, which is what I did unless it was marked personal. And I read the letter, and it was a very intelligent analysis of what the weaknesses of the situation were and what was needed. And I thought it was a really good letter. And I presented it to Swami. This is, so-and-so has some really good thoughts here. Swami read the letter. He balled it up in his hand, and he threw it on the ground. And he said, anybody can tell me what's wrong with the situation. What I want is someone who will say, I will step in and fix it. And I think that was for my benefit, because I was so impressed with the theory. And I've always remembered that anybody can say what's wrong with something. How many people in the world actually have that kind of commitment that stands in the light and let the shadow wail around them? I have planted my feet. I will do my best. I will give myself to the light. No, most of us don't have a destiny like Swami Kriyananda. He's one in every 5 generations probably before such a person appears again. So it's not a question. It is not a question of, am I talented? Can I write? Can I sing? Can I do this? Can I do that? One of the most wonderful, among many wonderful side benefits of all of this medical advance that allows people to die and come back. And we have this whole picture of the switch in perspective that comes to people when they die. Most recently, Jyotish wrote a blog about death and included a little link, which some of you may have read. If you haven't, go to ananda.org and look for it. You'll find it. Some American woman had a death experience and came back, and he included this little video, 30-minute video of her just talking about it. And the most significant thing that everyone whether they have positive or negative experiences, you all know that East West Bookshop is aligned with Ananda, and Swamiji always loved books, and when he would come here often, the then managers would present books to him that they thought he might be interested. And one of them was about near-death experiences that were horrible, where people just had terrifying, terrible experiences. And Swami's comment was, he said, I presumed that must also be true, because people who are naughty have their naughtiness presented to them very strongly. Just because I've introduced it, I will start with that one. This man who was a materialist, and he was an arrogant atheist, and he was a professor, had been a professor when he was living, and he loved to mock spiritual faith, and he loved to do everything he could to undermine people's faith in God. And he made a huge and very successful career out of being, a mocker of faith. And then he died. And he got to go to a world where there is no faith, and everybody mocks the possibility of light. And I guess, to put it in simple words, it was a nightmare. And he also, which is one of the things that happens, he experienced the consequences of his own action. And he saw how many hearts he had broken with his cynicism, with his ruthless cynicism about things that they held dear. And he didn't die. He was given an opportunity to come back, and he just realized how totally wrong he had been. He lost his career, he lost his wife, he lost everything. But, in very true words, he gained his soul. And coming back to the more positive one, when this woman, her name was Trisha, she saw what everyone sees with this, which is this world is not what it seems. And it's just that simple thought, which is so simple to say. It's like, how can it not be what it seems? Because it so seems to be what it seems to be. It seems so solid, it seems so real, it seems so profoundly the source of what we experience, doesn't it? And people come into this world, as I've chronologically developed and had more and more experiences over time, I finally noticed that I just never joined the mainstream. I didn't really know for sure that I would be able to do that, but I never did. I didn't want to when I was 16 and 17 and 18, and I just didn't want to. I told my dad I was never going to do it. He looked a little, doubtful, because a lot of people say they're never going to do it, but I said I was never going to do it, but I didn't know how I was going to avoid it. But golly shucks, I've been on the lunatic fringe for this whole time, and it looks like I'm going to make it to the end of the race without ever having to be different than that. But I look around, and of course, everybody has different karma. This is very important. That don't take this as a judgment, because it isn't. Our hearts, we have karma, we have unlearned lessons in the holy science, which Sai Ganesh actually gives a course on the holy science, which I highly recommend. I'm going to tell you in the next 1 minute everything I know from the holy science, by Sri Yukteswar, so I bow at your lotus feet on this one. He talks about purity of heart. Jesus confirmed, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. What keeps us from seeing this world as it really is, which is to see God in it, is because we have all these conflicting cross currents of ego-based self-definitions that cause us to believe that my happiness depends on, fill in the blank. We have long stories. My happiness depends on whatever it is. And all of that is karma, which is, it's an unlearned lesson. Because our happiness depends on none of this. Our happiness depends entirely on how deeply we are attuned to the light behind this world of shadows, and how much in this world of shadows we live in the light. And Sri Yukteswar describes, I believe it's 5 stages of the purity of the heart, and almost all of us are at number 2, which is not bad, because these are all pretty good. These are very advanced. And he uses the word, or at least it's translated into English, the propelled heart. The word compelled seems better to me than propelled, but anyway, however he wants to put it, it's not I didn't translate it, okay? It means that we have no choice. But we don't have choice in a bad way. We have no choice because, okay, my children, now you're going to go to school. Little kids don't necessarily want to go to school, but the parents tell them they have to go to school. There's a delightful story about a woman who was born and raised at Ananda village and is still there. And when she was young, her mother, her parents used to tell them lots of stories. The 3 children used to tell them lots of stories about saints. She became, when she was about 7, she became totally enamored with the Virgin Mary. And there had been several stories, the children of Fatima, the children of Garabandal, Saint Bernadette of Lourdes. And the consistent factor in all of these was that they were children, and they were girls, and she was a girl, and that many of them took care of sheep because they were just out in some field somewhere with the sheep. So she determined that what she was really interested in was having a vision of the Virgin Mary. So what she wanted was sheep. And definitely there was no reason to go to school because none of those children went to school. They just took care of sheep. So she'd reasoned the whole thing out, and it took a lot for her parents to persuade her that perhaps going to school was really a better plan. But we are all children. That's why we say Heavenly Father, Divine Mother. The only grown-up on the planet that I know is Swamiji, and he's already gone. So it's nothing but us kids left here anymore, as far as I can see. I'm sure there's other grown-ups, but he was my grown-up. Even still, at this age, over 70, every so often the concept of being a grown-up crosses my mind. And I think I'm really past the point where I can pretend not to be. It's just like what you see is what you get. That's just the end of the story. But we're propelled into these experiences because they're unlearned lessons. We are thrown into this world of shadows, and the only thing we need to be happy is to understand the light behind it. And that's what all of these people who go, as soon as they step out of this plane and get their bearings on the other side, oh my gosh, it was never what I thought it was. So one of the things when I was thinking about all of this and thinking about Swamiji, he threw that paper on the floor once, and once, for very valid personal reasons, someone he was depending on had to change their plans because of the needs of their children, which, of course, Swami, not for a moment would he have objected to that, but he just said, every time I get something together, and get some energy moving, something happens. And what happened was the karma of the situation shifted and, other karma had to take place. So it was, and I'll come back to this, it was every day Swami was pushing against that. He said, and he took an enormous amount of karma on his physical body. His physical body was just, when I spoke to him once about, you're taking all this tapasya onto your body, this was after some, there was a period of time where periodically he would nearly die, bleed to death, or have a heart attack, or be just completely crippled by some agonizing pain or something like that. And he would just persevere. And I just made some reference to it. He said, well, you might as well make use of the body if you have one. Just like, what are we here for? We are here to be instruments of the light. And he was always inwardly joyous. That's the only way I can say it. It's been a challenge in the 10 plus years now since he died. Well, not quite 10 years since he died, because he was an automatic reset. So I could just kind of lump along, and not many months would go by before I would have an opportunity to be in his company, and it would just reset everything. Oh yeah, I remember why I'm here. I remember how to do it. So even though the outward demeanor would go through many different things, there was always just this vibration underneath it. And at the end of his life, that vibration was completely on the surface. And he often said, I feel so much bliss. And he would say it like a child. I just don't know what to do with myself, is how he would put it. And he would weep at the slightest provocation, which was not at all who he'd been before. And no matter what subject he was supposed to talk about, he would spend a very brief time paying attention to what it was. And then he would start telling us that when he was 22 years old, he found Autobiography of a Yogi, and you would hear again the whole story of finding autobiography, coming to Master, and then he would stop because he would be so overcome, kneeling in front of Master, Master putting his finger on his heart, making him a disciple. And that was it. He was 85, 84. He'd done all of this. He'd become a world-renowned figure. He had written all these books and music, and I can make it all. It was pretty impressive. And the only thing he would keep telling us, and just speaking of a grown-up, somebody gave him this little, rather sentimental little figure of a little boy praying like this. And I, as I often did, because I made mistakes a lot of the time, I just sort of, looked at it and thought, pretty cheesy was pretty my response. And I might have said something like, what dark drawer should I put this thing in? And he said, no, put it on the mantle. And he referred to the person who'd given it to him. He said it was a very intuitive present, he said, because that's how I always see myself. This world of light and shadow, what is the light behind it? The light is we are all children of the light. And in the Old Testament, and the people who walk in the shadow have seen the great light. And the masters tell us this, the scriptures tell us this. And we've seen it in the lives of great saints. I've seen it right there in front of me, this transformation. And how do we become free? I'm asked so many different times, and the tone of the question there's a tone to the question. When I was a child, I was so intent on finding the meaning of life, and I mean really a child, a toddler, all the way through. And the people around me were good people. I was very fortunate in all my associations, upbringing. And they were wise to a point. But I could tell that they took the shadow for the light. They just didn't really, they believed this world. And I just had this feeling that it was just like I wasn't old enough. And I would get to be a certain age. We were Jewish, so maybe it was around your bar mitzvah time, when I become a man or whatever it is, that then they would all take you aside and they kind of put their arm around you and say, ha ha, big joke, here's what's really going on here. Imagine, as the years passed, and I realized they didn't know. They just didn't know. There you are. But some of us, so I'm often asked a question that I recognize, which is, there's a secret you're going to tell me now. And what's behind that is, do I really have to just put one foot in front of another for the rest of my life? And paradoxically, you see, and this is the weird thing, and I can't make it any more sensible to you than it's ever been to me. It shouldn't work. It shouldn't be worth it. I'm not making any progress. How can I carry on? But it does work. And you are making progress. And you will carry on. And it's absolutely worth it. It's absolutely worth it. There's no secret to success except 2 words. Don't quit. Doesn't matter how deep you get into that shadow. Know that there is no shadow without the light. Turn, face the light, and then we are home free. God bless you.